Good evening, and welcome to the Minneapolis Ward 1 City Council Candidate Forum. My name is Kathy Kramer, and I'm a member of the League of Women Voters Minneapolis, but not a resident of Ward 1. I'm pleased to be moderating this forum this evening. The League of Women Voters Minneapolis is a volunteer organization with a long history of providing unbiased candidate and issue information that is widely used by voters regardless of political beliefs. This forum is co-sponsored by the Northeast Park Neighborhood Association, Logan Park Neighborhood Association, Waite Park Community Council, and the League of Women Voters Minneapolis. The views expressed are those of the candidates and not those of the co-sponsors. Neither the League of Women Voters nor its co-sponsors endorse candidates or a political party. We are holding this forum for voters to hear from the candidates and to compare their ideas. This forum is being held in front of a live audience at the Northeast Recreation Center and is being live streamed to YouTube. The link is available at lwvmpls.org. Thank you to MCN6 for this production and recording of this event. We ask that campaign buttons or campaign t-shirts not be worn in this room and that no signs or literature be distributed during the event. Please remain as quiet as possible while the candidates are speaking so that everyone can hear the discussion. We also would ask that you hold your applause to the end of the forum so the candidates will have the maximum time to respond to your questions. And I know that's going to be hard to do, but we'll try on that one, okay? We'll work together on that. Finally, let's please silence all electronic devices. Located in Northeast Minneapolis, Ward 1 contains a rich heritage, as well as a mix of residential neighborhoods, parks, industrial areas, and commercial districts. It includes the neighborhoods of Audubon Park, Bottineau, Columbia Park, Como, Holland, Logan Park, Marshall Terrace, Mid-City Industrial, Northeast Park, Wake Park, and Wyndham Park. That's a lot of places. 2 candidates are running for Ward 1 City Council seat. The candidates were invited to the forum, and both have agreed to participate this evening. So thank you to both candidates. As a reminder, Minneapolis local elections have ranked choice voting instead of primaries. Even though we have 2 candidates for Ward 1, ballots will be formulated as ranked choice ballots in the event you want to add a write-in candidate. Let me introduce you to the candidates. Mr. Edwin Fruit.
Hi.
Okay, and Mr. Elliot Payne.
Hello, everyone.
We have timekeepers to help ensure that each candidate has the same amount of time to respond to the questions. Following the opening statements, each candidate will have up to 1.5 minutes to answer each question and 1 minute to make a closing statement. The timekeeper will hold up a card when there are 15 seconds left and a stop card when time is up. We ask that the candidate finish their sentence and stop at that point. We expect this forum to last about 1 hour. Questions from community members have been submitted in advance. During the forum, we will take written questions from the audience, and a volunteer will gather the questions and hand them to our question facilitators. We ask that the questions be clear and pertinent to issues at hand and made in the form of a question, not a statement. Questions must be directed to all candidates, and questions that are hostile or of a personal nature will not be asked. We may consolidate questions of the same general type, so please understand if your question is worded differently. All submitted questions are the property of the League of Women Voters Minneapolis. We will be asking questions about policing, public safety, housing, neighborhood welfare, climate and environmental equity, city government, and a few general questions. To get as many topics as possible, we will limit the questions in each category. Since there's never enough time to cover all the issues, if you feel your question was not addressed, please contact the candidates directly after the forum. Okay, for the candidate's opening statement, we ask they address this question. Why are you running for Ward 1 City Council seat, and what are your qualifications? Each candidate will have 2 minutes to respond, and we will start alphabetically by last name, and then we will rotate the order as we continue with the different questions. So Edwin Fruit is first, and I'll repeat the question. Why are you running for Ward 1 City Council seat, and what are your qualifications?
Hi, I'm running because we want to reflect the interests of the working class in this country. I work in an industrial bakery, and I'm a member of the Bakery Workers Union here in Minneapolis. In the last few years, we've seen an uptick in workers using their unions to take a stand against the intensifying exploitation and unrelenting drive for profit by the bosses. Today, some 25,000 auto workers are on strike, fighting to end the divisive two-tier system for wages, as well as fighting for cost of living increases and limiting forced overtime. This is a battle for the entire working class. We encourage people to go to the UAW picket lines, either in Hudson, Wisconsin, or in Plymouth, Minnesota, both with an easy driving range. I just came back this morning from the picket line in Hudson. The unions need to take their fight into the political arena, no relying on the Democratic or Republican parties, both representing the interests of the ruling rich. Organize a labor party based on the unions. Defending and extending the freedoms protected by the U.S. Constitution is at the center of the class struggle today. The Constitution includes universal rights limiting the reach of the state, protections that are deeply in the interest of workers and others. My party explains that we must oppose the U.S. rulers' relentless drive led by the Democratic Party to refurbish the reputation of the FBI and the government's political police force. The SWP explains that the tossing aside of the protections of free speech and political association and the use of the RICO laws against Donald Trump are precursors of what the government has done in the past and will do again to working people when we organize against the capitalist exploiters.
No, I know the question. Hello, everyone. My name is Elliot Payne. I use he, him pronouns. I first want to thank the League of Women Voters for hosting this event. And I want to thank you all for joining us. This is a really important conversation. I am currently the council member in Ward 1, and I'm running for re-election because, well, I should first start by saying I first ran for election in 2021 because I was so profoundly impacted by the murder of George Floyd. And at that time, I was working in City Hall helping to develop the behavioral crisis response. That's our dedicated mental health response. And at the time, it wasn't a guarantee that we would be able to launch that successfully. And now I'm proud to say that not only have we launched BCR, and it's been really well received, but I was a co-author on expanding their capacity by purchasing more vans, and then just recently was a co-author in expanding it for a 2-year contract so that can be a more permanent fixture of our public safety system. And as proud as I am about that work, it's not enough. And you don't need to take my word for it. The Department of Justice and the Minnesota Department of Human Rights agrees. We have 2 consent decrees that we have to implement. And I am deeply committed to implementing those consent decrees. And it's gonna take more than 1 term. It's gonna take more than 2 terms. It's gonna take many, many years in the city of Minneapolis to really transform our system of public safety, and I'm committed to that work. I'm also running for re-election because I am committed to addressing our affordable housing crisis. We have unfinished business on rent stabilization, and I'm committed to moving forward a policy that can work for everyone in Ward 1, and the city for that matter. We have a climate equity plan that we have to implement. We need to develop a humane response to our encampments. There is a lot of work yet to do, and I'm very deeply committed to doing that work, and I hope that I can earn your support to follow through on what we started. Thank you.
Now we move to questions from the community. You will have 1.5 minutes to answer these questions, and we will begin with Elliot Payne, and then Edwin Fruit for the first question, and rotate the order for the questions that follow. Okay. We'll start with policing and public safety. What role do you see the City Council playing in the Community Commission on Police Oversight? I'll repeat it again. What role do you see the City Council playing in the Community Commission on Police Oversight?
So we developed a community commission on police oversight at the end of the year last year. And this was a reform around our previous civilian oversight program. I'm proud to say that a large number of amendments that I authored were passed in that final ordinance, yet it didn't go far enough. And so I think one of the things that we need to do is make sure that we are effectively lobbying the state government, and I can say that we have been successful in striking through some state statute language that actually put limits on civilian oversight. And now one of the number one things I'm going to be doing next term is revisiting our CCPO ordinance to make sure that true civilian oversight can happen in the city of Minneapolis. We also need to be a really important voice for those commissioners. They're going to be in a position where they need to know that City Council supports their work, that they can work without interference or interruption, whether it's from the police union or any other special interests. And so we can't have true civilian oversight without those commissioners being able to do their work and having the support of council in doing that work.
Under the capitalist system that we live under in Minneapolis and every other jurisdiction around the country, the purpose of the police is to protect and serve the interests of the wealthy and the property classes. That's their function. And we aren't going to be able to change that until we have a truly workers and farmers government that will replace that institution. You can't reform it. I've heard this for 40, 50 years, even back when I was a teenager. Police review boards, reform. It doesn't work because of what the nature of the system is, and until you replace that, you can't do that. I'm not for getting rid of the police because you need police, but ultimately the whole system will have to be overturned. I am for prosecuting and putting on trial any policeman or police person who brutalizes or kills a civilian. That, I think, and we have to be in the streets to do that if that's necessary. But you can't reform the police. Review boards, better, programs for police cadets, all that, it doesn't work because that's not what their function is. Their function is to protect the wealthy and make sure that the system keeps operating.
Okay, our next question, still with policing and public safety. Edwin Fruit will be first. How do you propose that the City Council work with the Metropolitan Council to improve public transit safety, including transit stations and ridership?
I think that it's all part of the same thing. We have big problems in this city and other cities around the country. A lot of antisocial behavior, young people doing things that they shouldn't be doing, and it's part of the deterioration of the whole system that we live under. And until we begin to change that, you're not going to be able to really solve these particular problems. I know during the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s, there was a decrease of crime in the cities because there was a movement of people trying to make change. And that has a big impact, especially on young people, that they have some alternative to do something positive. And we're going to need more of that. Individual policing or putting more police on train stations is not going to solve the problems that are being caused in society.
Could you repeat the question?
How do you propose that the City Council work with the Metropolitan Council to improve public transit safety, including transit stations and ridership?
So I sit on the Transportation Advisory Board at Metropolitan Council. There's one seat for a Minneapolis council member, and that's where we do our regional planning for transportation, including highway investments and public transit. And I use that role to advocate for more transit access. I think it's really important for our city, especially as we're growing. And part of that growth is going to require that people feel safe on the trains. And so there's a lot that we can do when it comes to the allocation of resources, particularly at that planning level, because some of those planning decisions that we make translate to the decision to have more of a presence on the trains. I've advocated for getting signs made that give people more awareness about Stevens Law, and that's the law that allows you to not be at risk of liability if you give somebody a Narcan to reverse an overdose. There's things like that that are both small and large that can help improve safety on the trains. But we also are getting into joint powers agreements with the Metropolitan Transit Police Department. And one of the things that I've been working on is making sure that any police department that's operating within the jurisdiction of Minneapolis has to abide by the exact same rules as the Minneapolis Police Department, including both consent decrees from the state and the federal government.
I'm going to move into questions related to housing. And Elliot, you'll be the first to answer. How would you, as a city council member, increase the availability of affordable housing?
Housing is one of the most complex policy areas because there's a lot of intersection between private for-profit interests and our public need for affordable housing. And a lot of the programs that we have in the city are really trying to, weave a narrow thread to be able to balance these issues. One of the big programs that we have is our Affordable Housing Trust Fund. That is a gap financing program that allows private developers to build more affordable units by having some of the cost of building offset by the city. And one of my big things around housing is that as complex as it is, we don't need to make it too complex. What it ultimately comes down to is there is a cost to build housing and there's a cost to rent. And if we want those rents to come down, we have to subsidize those costs. The source of that subsidy is where the complexity comes in. It can be tax credits or direct subsidy, but we need to not only grow our Affordable Housing Trust Fund investments, and we have done that in recent years, but we also need to advocate for things like a municipal bank that could provide more financing options for more affordable housing.
Okay, I'm going to read you an article here, not the whole thing. According to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, older adults are the fastest growing segment of the homeless population. Workers 55 and older made up nearly 20% of those living in homeless shelters, and thousands more live in their car or on the street. With the lifting of the rent moratoriums after the pandemic, evictions have risen by over 50% in some cities, including here in Minneapolis. This is not going to be solved under this system. As long as you've got billionaire developers who own the apartment buildings, who own big tracts of land, they're going to build these huge apartment buildings like they're building in the suburbs here because they want to make money off it. They can't make money off somebody who's living on Social Security. So they're going to charge as much as they can, and that's the way the system works. Till we make a revolution in this country and change the whole system of mortgages and how the land is used in this country, we're not going to solve the problems of homelessness. It can't be solved under this system. That's why I'd say the perspective is we need to have a kind of government, a government of workers and farmers led by a labor party and not depend on the two-party system.
And this one is, I knew I was going to get confused on Edwin. Edwin, you go first. All right. As a city council member, what specific strategies do you support or propose for our homeless population? And please also address issues related to those living in encampments.
There's really no reason to have homeless people in this country. It's supposedly the wealthiest country in the world. We spend millions and millions and millions of dollars, you know, on weapons in this country and sending weapons other places. The priority is not for working people. The priority is for profits and increasing the wealth of the rich, not things like building housing for working people. That's not the way the system works. That's why the system has to be changed. There's nothing that we can do in city council here or any other city council that's going to solve the problem. You need to spend millions and millions of dollars to build housing for working people, not just for wealthy people. And that's going to take a national effort. It's not going to happen in one city or one state. But as long as you have private entities that control the real estate industry, they're only interested in making money, not in making houses for people who need it. That's why I advocate we need a different kind of government, a workers' and farmers' government that will deal with these problems in the way that everybody here wants to see it done. It's not going to happen under the system.
Could you repeat the question?
Absolutely. As a city council member, what specific strategies do you support or propose for our homeless population? And please also address issues related to encampments. Thank you.
So the solution to houselessness is houses. And so that's the starting point that we have to have. People living on the street, I think, are often put into one bucket, and we throw around words like addiction and mental health as the kind of sole issue that's at hand here, and there's a lot of factors involved. Part of it is just the overall cost of housing is pushing people into homelessness, and so we need to keep homelessness rare. We need to prevent it from happening in the first place. And we need to be able to have the types of housing combined with supportive services so that people are opting into that type of living arrangement. And the reason that we have encampments is because of policy failures across every layer of government. And what I see my role as a council member is to be that person on the ground that understands what's happening. So I spent a lot of time at the Quarry encampment getting to know the people who live there, getting to know their stories and their circumstances. And it turns out that, you know, some people are dealing with really severe mental health issues. And I talked to another gentleman who'd arrived 2 days earlier. He was still wearing an Oxford shirt, and he had just gotten kicked out of his hotel and got on a bus to Minneapolis because that's where the bus driver said he should go. And so you can't treat everybody the same in those scenarios. You have to have that on-the-ground understanding of what's happening and then act as a coordinator across those areas of government.
We'll transition now to questions related to neighborhood support and welfare. And this goes to Elliot Payne first. Do you see the neighborhood association and councils benefiting your ward? Why or why not? How would you address neighborhood association funding?
Neighborhood associations are the most frontline grassroots civic institution in our city. And I think that they're a very critically important part of our city and of our community. And one of the ways that I'm trying to support neighborhoods is by making sure that we have strong neighborhoods. And so I'm seeing some of our neighborhood leaders in the audience tonight. We just had a leadership summit last night, and we hold quarterly meetings so that neighborhoods can learn from each other, share resources, and ultimately advocate for a strong network of neighborhoods. So I do support increasing funding for neighborhoods. The mayor's budget has increased the base funding, but we need to explore new ways of keeping neighborhoods sustainable because the current funding levels are just not sustainable over the long term. And so I'm very committed to working with our neighborhoods, making sure that they're strong and making sure that we're identifying ways of keeping them sustainable.
I'll get back to the systemic problem again. The capitalist system holds no future for working people. We see all the ills of capitalist society, including homelessness, drug addiction, lack of adequate and affordable health care and child care, and workers being forced to work more than one job to make ends meet, and being forced to work massive overtime as a condition of employment. You can't go home after 8 hours when the boss says you got to stay 4 more hours. I don't care if you have to pick up your kid. They don't care about that. The responsibility for raising and caring for children and other vulnerable family members still falls predominantly on women in this society. Emancipation of women requires removing all obstacles to a woman's full and equal participation in social and economic life and activity, as well as a woman's right to decide matters related to her own life and health, free of veto by family members or courts or legislatures. Neighborhood associations, like Elliot said, there's no money. In fact, money's being cut. All the social services are being cut. In the rural areas, there's been articles about the rural areas of Minnesota. They're closing hospitals, closing clinics, and it's creating a big problem because there's no money, because the society doesn't care about the children and they don't care about the elderly, let alone the rest of us.
One more question related to neighborhood support and welfare. And Edwin, you'll get to respond first. And this is from our audience members. How will you support workers in Minneapolis through issues in public safety, housing initiatives, etc.?
Well, one way to support workers is to make sure that every workplace has a union. We need more unions in this country, and that's why I started off the talk here by saying that there's been an uptick. There's been more union fights in the last 3 or 4 years than we've seen in the last couple of decades. From the UPS to the United Auto Workers to other fights. My union has had fights, strikes by Nabisco and Frito-Lay and other, and we have a strike now in Memphis, Tennessee that's been going on for 4 months, that the bosses don't want to address the changes that workers need. We need more workers being able to address their conditions on the job as far as safety, as far as control of production, and that will make things easier for workers. There was just a big fight by rail workers in this country for having a decent way of living, having to be on call 24/7 if you're a rail worker, and you know you've got to be a safe worker because of all the derailments there are. You've got to have that time off to rest and to sleep and to have time with your family. And young people can't even start families now because there's a high percentage of young people that are still living with their parents. They can't afford a rent to start to have a place to live, let alone think about raising children. That's part of the problem that has to be solved.
Yes, please.
Okay. How will you support workers in Minneapolis through issues in public safety, housing initiatives, etc.?
We can thank the labor movement for the 40-hour work week. So every single worker, whether they're in a union or not, is benefiting from the wins that organized labor has gotten us. And at the same time, organized labor is under assault more than it's ever been before. And so I think not only do workers need to organize in their unions and organize politically, but we as elected people need to be advocating for all workers, whether they're in a union or not. And so that means passing laws such as wage protection, safe and sick time, and making sure that we're funding the enforcement of those worker protections at every step along the way. And so I see my role as a council member as not only supporting the labor movement and making sure that people are free to organize without interruption or union busting from their employer, but also that we have laws in place that are protecting those workers that don't have the benefit of a union.
I actually have one more question in the neighborhood support and welfare. And this question goes to Elliot Payne first. Our ward is home to many small businesses, many of whom have struggled over the past 3 years. What specifically will you do as city council member to support small businesses?
Before I was council member, I worked in City Hall in the Office of Performance and Innovation, and one of the projects that I worked on was creating a small business portal, which was a resource for small businesses to navigate city process, understand what types of programs exist to benefit them, and just overall try to make the complexity and the bureaucracy of City Hall more understanding. That was, I feel, a very successful project, but at the end of the day, oftentimes what you need as a small business is capital and for people to get out of your way so that you can pursue your entrepreneurial dream. And so one of the programs the city has is called our BTAP program, Business Technical Assistance, where we provide free consulting services to help you start, grow, or start and expand your business. And so I think one of the things that I can do specifically is make sure that we are funding those programs at an adequate level, but then also thinking about what kind of grant opportunities or even loan opportunities are out there that can break down the barriers to the access to capital that do exist within our system.
No, it's okay. As a socialist, I'm not opposed to small business. We think small businesses play a very important part in how this society functions. But as long as you've got a banking system where you try to get a loan and they say, okay, but you know, you're going to pay a 20% interest, maybe 25% interest, it makes it very hard for people that are trying to establish themselves and open up businesses like that. The same is true for working farmers. You know, farmers are having especially the family farmers, having a very hard time, and we're for, you know, subsidy of farmers so that they make enough to be able to have, you know, be able to meet the cost of living and not go into debt. It's just part of what's happening in this country. The student debts are about to be put back in effect again. You have to start paying, and you know what your interest rate. Is this still working? Okay. Anyway, but as long as you're beholden to Wells Fargo and the Bank of America and all those places, it's going to be very difficult for that to happen. You know, there are more small businesses that go out of business than come into business because it's hard to do it, and the government should be supporting it. But again, there's the lack of funds and the question of the banks more interested in making profits than in helping people start their businesses.
Thank you. We'll transition now to climate, environmental equity, and action plans. The next question was submitted by Community Power. We agreed that this next question will be asked at all candidate forums. Okay. This one's a bit wordy, so feel free to ask me to clarify as we go through, okay? All right. Minneapolis's current funding for equitable client action is about $2 to $3 million annually, coming from what's called the franchise fee. Xcel and CenterPoint utility customers in Minneapolis pay this as a percentage of their total utility bills. What scale of dedicated funding do you, as a city council member believe is needed to meet Minneapolis's climate goals in an equitable way, and where would you propose this funding should come from? And Edwin Fruit, you go first.
As long as you have companies like Xcel and other companies privately run, they're in business to make profits, it's going to be very difficult to control those things. You know, we're for eventually nationalizing all the energy industry and making it the ownership of the people. That's what it should be. It shouldn't be in private hands because they're only trying to make money off it. Just like the sales tax just got raised by what, 1% now in the state of Minnesota or the city of Minneapolis. We don't think working people should be taxed. There's plenty of wealthy people that can be taxed, but even that is not going to solve the problem of climate change, you know, the effects of climate change or anything else. Only when working people are in the government, and I'm talking about, you know, you look at U.S. Congress, for instance. You can't be in the U.S. Congress if you're not a millionaire. There's no steel workers or garment workers or any other kind of workers in the U.S. Congress. That's why we call for a labor party. We need workers in government, and working people together can solve the problems of the climate and all the other problems that we're talking about here tonight.
Should I repeat it?
No, I think I'm ready. Yeah.
Okay.
So we have to first start this conversation by acknowledging that climate is a global problem, but we feel it at the local level. And the scale of the problem is vastly larger than a local government's budget. One estimate is that it would take $2 to $2.7 billion over 20 years for us to meet our carbon neutral goals in the city of Minneapolis. And that's an overwhelming number to consider. But what we did this year is we passed our climate equity plan. And what's different this year compared to 10 years ago when we passed our climate action plan is we're actually tying funding to this plan. And we're going to raise that funding through our franchise fee. That's the fee that the energy utilities pay to run their power lines through the right-of-way. And so we're going to be raising up to $10 million as our starting point with a focus on addressing weatherization and efficiency for our green zones neighborhoods. So those are the regions in the city that have been disproportionately impacted by pollution. It's a climate justice area that we've defined. And so with that $10 million investment, we're gonna go door to door and make sure that people know that A, the city's gonna invest in making their home more energy efficient, but B, we're gonna help them unlock the federal dollars that were passed under Biden's Inflation Reduction Act.
Another question dealing with climate and environmental equity and action plans. A key strategy of the Minneapolis' climate equity plan is to switch heating and appliances from gas to electric. How would you, as a city council member, go about transitioning our heating and cooling systems and appliances in a way that doesn't leave people or neighborhoods behind? And Mr. Payne, you'll go first.
Like I said, I think we need to start in those green zone neighborhoods. Those are the most economically disadvantaged, often black and brown communities. And so the federal government, through the Inflation Reduction Act, has made a lot of incentives and subsidies available, but they're gonna be really challenging to unlock for day-to-day people who are busy going about their lives. So part of this $10 million investment that the city is making is to go door to door and make sure that everyone knows about these programs and that we can offset the cost of the investment of replacing your gas stove with an induction stove, making sure that you know that you can get a heat pump so that you can reduce your fossil gas use through heating your home. And this is gonna require some direct dollar investment, both from the city and federal government, and I think that that is where we wanna start. What I'm also interested in is a way to phase out some of the gas appliances by looking at our ordinances around the ability to have gas appliances, because I think we need to create this transition as fast as possible.
I don't have enough information to say that this is a good thing to do, to get rid of gas and do everything electric. So I don't want to comment on that. What I do want to comment on is that electricity is expensive, very expensive. And the burden of it should not be put on working people to pay those extra expenses. The thing I said at the beginning about people on Social Security who get $1,500 to $2,000 a month, but yet their rents are over $2,000 a month. That's the situation for working people, and especially elderly people who've already worked their whole lives and been productive in society, and now they're just being told, too bad, go live in your car if you can't afford $2,000 for a one-bedroom apartment. It's all part of the same problem. If you want to go over to electricity, then we shouldn't be raising the rates. And if Xcel doesn't like that, then we should nationalize them and make that Xcel a property of the state, a property of the government, and not put the burden on working people.
We have one question related to city government, and Edwin Fruit, you'll go first on this one. As a city council member, you are responsible to both your ward specifically and to the city. How will you manage this, especially when priorities conflict?
Well, it depends what problem you're talking about trying to solve. And a lot of these problems, whether it's in this district or all the other districts, can't be solved without massive influx of money to be able to change things. And that's not going to come under this system. It's just not going to come. So you can have all kinds of meetings and you can decide to do all kinds of things, like Elliot was talking about, the homeless problem and, you know, workers on the job. But until workers run the government, you're not going to have the kind of changes that we need to make life comfortable for working people and the ability to be able to live a decent life without worrying about you know, whether you're going to be thrown out into the street or whether you can afford, you know, they're going to have everybody have electric vehicles, and there'll only be $70,000 or $80,000 for a car. Now, who's going to be able to afford that? Well, you're going to pay $800 a month on credit, you know, because you can't pay the whole thing, and that's going to put you in a worse situation. So these are all problems that are helping make the wealthy more wealthy and putting more burden on working people, and that's what we're opposed to.
My approach to balancing the needs of the ward versus the needs of the city is to spend a lot of time in the ward, because you can't look out for the people of Ward 1 if you don't know what's happening in Ward 1. And the way that I try to do this is I host regular office hours twice a month, once in the morning, once in the evening. I see some regular office hour attendees here, and you get to hear about the things that are happening in the community in those settings. We talked about neighborhood associations. It's really important to show up to neighborhood association meetings, because then you get a sense of what's happening in the neighborhoods. Because the decisions that we make for one person, you have to always keep in mind the impact on the hundreds of thousands of people around that policy decision. And so you have to spend equal amount of time inside of City Hall as you do out in the ward, so that you are connecting with what's really happening on the ground. Whether that is around the weeds on Johnson Street or a homeless encampment. You can't make policy around these issues if you don't know what the on-the-ground impact is. And so I make it a really important point to spend as much time in the community, talking to residents one-on-one, hearing about what's happening for them, and then trying to translate that to a policy level that would serve the city as a whole.
We'll move to general questions. Specific to policy making, how will you work with communities most impacted by the issues we face, particularly those have been historically marginalized? And Elliot Payne, I think you go first, right?
So I personally know what it feels like to be marginalized. My background is mechanical engineering, and I have an MBA. And you would be shocked by how many people talk to me like I'm an idiot that doesn't know better, and that they know better than I do. And so one of the things that is extraordinarily important is recognizing the humanity that we all have and treating everyone with dignity. I think that oftentimes these disparities happen because people think they know best for other people. And what that ultimately does is it's undermining and undervaluing the humanity of our community. It's undervaluing the humanity of somebody who is a single mother who has a lot more knowledge than I do about raising kids, right? There's so much wisdom within everyone's lived experience, and the moment that we bucket everybody into a stereotype and think that we know what's best for them, that's when we're leaving people behind and we're marginalizing. And so through my lived experience as a Black man and having experienced these types of issues, I know how important it is to value everyone's voice. And that's why I spend so much time in the community making sure that I'm listening to and uplifting those voices.
Well, I referred in earlier about the civil rights movement. I mean, what we're going to need is a new movement of working people, people that are called marginalized, and everybody else, to change the kind of system we live under. That's the only way that we're going to change it, by getting people together and beginning to exercise our power. Somebody once asked Malcolm X, how do you explain people's oppression? He said, I don't explain people's oppression. I said, we explain that people need to have their self-worth. And that's exactly what we're talking about. It doesn't matter where you come from. It matters that we have a system that doesn't care about working people. And of course, because of the systematic racism we have in society, it's worse for people who, who have been discriminated against and continue to be discriminated against. But it's going to take a movement of working people, all of us together, to make the changes that we need. That's the only way it's going to happen. And when we do that and we exercise our power together, we'll be able to change the things that we've been talking about tonight. Otherwise, it's the same thing. Homelessness, poverty, lack of jobs, expensive child care. It's been happening for years and years and years, and no city council has ever solved it, because you're under a system that needs to be changed.
Okay. People under 35 make 55% of the city's population. What do you see as the role of young people in decisions that impact our city and communities? And Mr. Fruit, you can go first. Yeah, you gotta be closer.
Well, yeah, we have to figure that out, and that's also part of what's going to have to happen when we build a movement. Because when you build a movement, young people are the ones that are spearheading it out in front. It was young people that started the civil rights movement with the sit-ins, with the bus, the freedom rides, everything else. They were the ones that spearheaded that movement, which then, was able to be taken on by the rest of the proletarian working class, especially in the South. But you have to know what the problem is first, and the problem is the system, and you have to begin organizing to change that. And the same thing is true for young people. Our education system doesn't educate. It never has and never will under this system. For the majority of young people, the thing is to get out of school and learn how to punch a clock and do what you need to do. It has nothing to do with learning or thinking or critical thought or anything else. And until we change that, we're not going to be able to involve people in changing society.
So I am as old as you can be and still technically be a millennial. So, and even just with my age, I see the generational divide between my lived experience and people younger than me. I'm a homeowner. I have not had to find a rental apartment in over 10 years. Liam in the back here, who works in my office, he has had to move twice a year since I've known him, on average. And you become quickly out of touch the moment that you have the type of stability of home ownership. You become quickly out of touch the moment that you have the stability of a full-time job. I don't work multiple jobs to make ends meet. So I don't know personally what that lived experience is at this stage of my life. I was raised by a single mother. We were very poor. She was a teacher. I know what it's like to be poor, but being poor in the 80s is different than being poor right now. And so it's vitally important that we have young people involved in our political process because, as young at heart, I still like to think of myself, my beard's getting quite gray, right? I'm getting out of touch every day. And so we need to empower young people to participate in our political process. And we can do that through things like our youth organizing board as a part of our city policymaking process.
Well, we have time for one last question before our closing comments. And the last question goes to Elliot Payne first. What do you think will be the most important issue you will deal with as a city council member? And this is a question from the audience.
I think I want to say this on a long time scale around the decisions I make today and what kind of profound impact it'll have. And I think, being the epicenter of the murder of George Floyd, it feels like our first answer to this question should be something around the future of public safety, and that is vitally important. But I think the only honest answer is climate change and what choices we make today that are going to impact the future, because we are running out of time and the changes to our climate are happening exponentially. And so every intervention that we do right now is going to have a multiplication effect 5, 10, 50 years from now. And so I think the way that we respond to climate change today is the most important decisions we can make.
I would say the most important thing right now is for working people is to break from the two-party system, the Democrats and Republicans. They both represent the interests of the ruling rich, and everything that is carried out in the city, in the state, and nationally is in the interest of that ruling class that we have to get rid of. That's the key thing. That's why we call for a Labor Party. Malcolm X also said, the Republicans are the wolves, and the Democrats are the wolves in sheep's clothing. And you can see that by what President Biden did when he basically told the rail workers last fall, you cannot go on strike because it'll disrupt the economy. And he probably will end up doing that to the auto workers if they don't settle soon. I don't know. But his interests are to keep the economy going and to keep the boss's profits rolling in. That's what their job is. We need to break and have our own party, a party that represents the interests of the vast majority of workers and farmers and small business people who are being exploited by the system that we live under.
Thank you. We're now at the part of the agenda where we will have the candidates make closing statements. Each candidate will have 1 minute for their closing statement. And Mr. Elliott Fruit? Yeah. Oh, Edwin Fruit. I knew I was going to do that. The two first names with an E. Okay, I'm sorry. At least I waited to the very end to trip over my tongue here. All right. Okay. Edwin Fruit, will you go first with your closing statements, and you have 1 minute. Thank you.
So I'm not saying vote for me and I will set you free. We don't believe in that. We think that our campaign explains that the working class needs to take political power out of the hands of the capitalist class. That's the only way we're going to solve these problems. It's that process of building a movement capable of leading revolutionary change that can transform society into one based on working class solidarity and allowing for the greatest flowering of human creativity and scientific achievement. In other words, organized society based on human needs and not profit, and including the protection of democratic rights for all.
Well, I want to first thank the League of Women Voters for hosting this event tonight. I want to thank you all for joining us. This has been a really, really great conversation. And I just want to say that Minneapolis is at a crossroads. The trauma of 2020 is fading. Just this week, the mayor officially lifted the emergency that we were under COVID. We're gathering in person. Things are starting to feel like they're going back to normal. But the stakes have not changed since 2020. The system has not changed since 2020. And we are at a crossroads where the status quo is not sustainable. And so I have been a very consistent voice for change, and I've been a very consistent voice for this community, and I hope with your support I can continue to be that voice. So thank you.
Yes, now it's time. You've done very well. You get A+. On behalf of all the co-sponsors, I thank the candidates for Ward 1 City Council for being part of the democratic process by running for office and for being willing to serve our community. We hope the forum has helped voters make an informed decision. Many thanks to MCN6 for recording this forum and to Minneapolis Park and Recreation for providing us space. The studio and video recording of this forum will be available unedited on the League of Women Voters Minneapolis website, lwvmpls.org. Recordings may not be edited by the candidates or the public or used for partisan purposes. The League also researches issues important to our members and the health of our communities. If you are interested in finding out more about what we do and how you can make a difference, please visit our website and consider joining us as a member or a volunteer. You can find more nonpartisan information about candidates and about voting at another League website called Vote 411. Information on voting and registering to vote also can be found on the Minnesota Secretary of State website, mnvotes.gov. Remember, Election Day is Tuesday, November 7th. Early voting began September 22nd and continues through November 6th. Please vote. Your voice matters. Thank you. And one more time, let's say thank you to our two candidates.
Thank you for having the event. Appreciate it.